Get down. Don't move. 3 men wearing fake security uniforms just kicked down my door like they were some kind of police team. One angry guy with a taser pressed it right against my 16-year-old daughter's neck. I was still wearing my cooking apron. I hadn't even turned off the stove yet. I barely knew what was happening when they put handcuffs on Emma and dragged her out like she was some dangerous criminal. No warrant. No explanation. Just one reason. Breaking serious neighborhood rules. Me in the comments where you're watching from. Because this story gets crazy fast. And they had no idea what they just walked into my house. This wasn't an arrest. This was war. I was making dinner for Emma after her soccer practice. The garlic bread was getting brown in the oven. Water was boiling on the stove. I could hear her laughing upstairs. She was probably texting her teammates about making it to the big games. Perfect. Thursday night in our little corner of Oakwood Heights, North Carolina. Then my front door exploded, like someone hit it with a hammer. The first thing I saw wasn't their uniforms or badges. It was how they moved. These guys acted like they had training. But something felt wrong about how they stood. 22 years in the military taught me how to read people. And these men were trying too hard to look official. Derek was the one with the taser. His face looked like an angry dog. His uniform looked real from far away. But up close I could see it came from some cheap online store. Marcus Reynolds, HOA Security. Get down now. He yelled like he was trying out for a TV cop show. I dropped the wooden spoon I was holding and turned off the stove. My military training kicked in automatically. Check the threat. Protect civilians. Get information. Emma came running down the stairs in her soccer shoes. What's happening, Dad? That's when the second guy, Tommy, jumped forward and grabbed her arms. Emma Reynolds, you're under neighborhood arrest for breaking multiple rules, Tommy said. He put handcuffs on my daughter like she was some hardened criminal. The sound of those handcuffs clicking shut hit me harder than any enemy fire I'd ever faced. My little girl, who still had Disney princess stickers on her bedroom mirror, was being arrested in my own home by men with fake badges and real weapons. What rules? Emma cried. I could hear the fear in her voice. That's when Derek started reading. From what looked like a legal paper. But it sounded like someone copied random neighborhood rules from the internet. 47 violations. Playing music at 3 p.m. Parking your car 3 inches over the line. Having 3 friends visit at the same time. Not keeping your lawn pretty during the drought. The list went on and on. Each charge was more ridiculous than the last. I read the document in 30 seconds. A skill I learned reading intelligence reports. In war zones. Most of these violations happened in the past 2 weeks. Right after I refused to join Rick Pitton's new neighborhood security plan that would cost each family an extra $200 every month. Tommy showed me more paperwork that looked official. At first glance. Complete with signatures and legal words. Private security working under HOA authority. Completely legal, he said with confidence, like someone who practiced this speech. I spent years training soldiers to spot fake documents and mind games. The signatures were fake. The legal language was copied from internet templates. And their detention place had no real address listed anywhere. Derek turned on his taser when I stepped forward. The electric crackling filled my kitchen like angry bees. Wrong, he shouted. HOA Rules Section 1(2)B gives us emergency powers. Emma started crying. That's when I realized this wasn't some mistake or overzealous rule enforcement. This was a planned military-style operation designed to scare my family into giving up. Rick Pitton had declared war on the wrong house. My tactical thinking kicked in automatically. 3 armed men with questionable authority. My daughter restrained. And terrified. Unknown backup or escape plan. 22 years training, Green Berets taught me that the first rule is protecting civilians. Even when those civilians happen to be your own family. Don't make things worse until you understand the full situation. Don't let emotion override strategy. And never, ever underestimate your enemy's preparation or desperation. Fine, I said calmly. But I'm calling our lawyer. Derek laughed like I just told him I was calling Santa Claus. Call whoever you want, army man, he sneered. Your daughter comes with us until family compliance is verified. They dragged Emma toward a black van with no license plates while every instinct screamed at me to take action. Tommy blocked my path at the front door. Stay here and wait for instructions, he commanded with the kind of authority that comes from holding all the cards. Watch that van disappear around the corner with my daughter's terrified face pressed against the back window. Something cold and calculating settled into my chest. Rick Patton thought he just taught me a lesson about neighborhood respect and following rules. He had no idea he just declared war on someone who spent 2 decades teaching the most dangerous soldiers in the world how to win battles that seemed impossible. The only question now was whether Rick would surrender before I had to show him exactly what those skills looked like when applied to civilian warfare. 60 minutes later, I was staring at Officer Powell in my living room. He was scratching his head over Rick's stack of legal documents. 911 operator had been confused when I reported the kidnapping. Sir, HOAs don't have arrest authority. But here we were dealing with what appeared to be a smart legal loophole designed to keep law enforcement away. Powell was a 15-year veteran with a solid reputation. But even he seemed uncertain about how to handle private security contractors working under neighborhood authority. That's when Police Captain Morrison showed up personally, which should have been my first warning sign. Morrison was a big fish in our small pond, the kind of guy who didn't make house calls unless something important was at stake. Turns out he and Rick had been golf buddies for 5 years, meeting every Thursday at the country club to discuss neighborhood improvement and local politics. Powell, this appears legitimate, Morrison said after barely looking at Rick's paperwork. Private security operating under HOA authority with proper documentation and insurance certificates. Rick arrived 20 minutes later with his briefcase and confident smile, looking like a successful businessman who happened to be doing his civic duty. Officer Powell, he said warmly. Just community safety protocols in action. Emma is at a secure location getting education about neighborhood standards until the family addresses some compliance issues. He showed a 3-ring binder full of official-looking documents, complete with notarized signatures and legal references. That would have impressed anyone who didn't know how to spot forgeries. The phone call from County Supervisor Williams sealed the deal. Morrison put him on speaker while Williams explained that they'd reviewed the HOA agreement and found an emergency powers clause that allowed private contractors for rule enforcement in extreme circumstances. The conversation felt rehearsed, like everyone involved had their lines memorized. I realized Rick hadn't just planned this operation. He'd built a network of official support that would make legal intervention nearly impossible. That evening, Mrs. Patterson knocked on my door. With the courage of someone who finally decided to speak truth to power. At 73, she'd been the HOA treasurer for 12 years. Watching Rick gradually cut her out of financial decisions while claiming to modernize their accounting systems. Mac, I think Rick is doing something illegal with HOA money, she whispered, looking around like she expected someone watching. I've been keeping separate records because something didn't feel right about his expense reports. Her revelation hit like a nuclear weapon. Rick had systematically stolen $47,000 over 6 months, creating fake bills for security infrastructure and legal compliance consultants that existed only on paper. The money had funded Derek and Tommy's operation while covering Rick's expenses. including his new boat and his wife Karen's luxury spa. Weekends. Mrs. Patterson had documented everything in her careful handwriting. Dates and amounts that painted a picture of systematic fraud. At 10 p.m., Brady Patton climbed over my back fence like some teenage spy movie. Rick's 17-year-old son had been waiting years for someone to challenge his father's increasingly controlling behavior. Mr. Reynolds, my dad's lost his mind, Brady said, his voice shaking with years of held-back anger. I know where Emma is, and I know why he did this. The kid had been living under Rick's obsessive control since childhood. Every friend screened, every activity watched, every moment of privacy invaded in the name of proper development. Brady explained that Emma's rejection of his romantic advances a month earlier had been the excuse. Rick needed to escalate a campaign he'd been planning for months. You have to understand, Brady continued. Dad doesn't handle rejection well. When Emma said no to dating me, he took it as a personal insult to our family. That this isn't really about dating. It's about control. He can't stand that you and Emma represent everything he can't dominate in this community. I called Colonel Rodriguez at Fort Bragg, my old team leader who transitioned to private investigation after retirement. Rodriguez had the kind of network that could map criminal operations in hours rather than days. Brother, give me 12 hours, he said without hesitation. I'll have complete intelligence on this entire situation. Rick called me at midnight with his updated demands. Mac, the compliance period has expired, he announced like some corporate middle manager delivering quarterly targets. New requirements include a public apology on Nextdoor acknowledging inappropriate behavior toward community leadership, a $15,000 community restoration fine, and signing temporary property management authority to the HOA for oversight purposes. His voice carried the satisfaction of someone who believed he held all the power. My response was measured and calm, drawing on decades of military training in psychological operations. Rick, you have 12 hours to return my daughter safely. After that, this becomes a different kind of problem entirely. I could hear the uncertainty creep into his voice as he realized that his pressure campaign wasn't producing the expected results. 22 years of teaching soldiers had taught me that bullies rely on fear and intimidation, but they crumble quickly when facing someone who refuses to be intimidated. That night, I stood in my backyard looking at Emma's bedroom window, the light still on from her evening routine of reading before sleep. Rick Patton thought he'd played his strongest hand by manipulating the legal system and isolating me from official support. What he didn't realize was that he just forced me to activate capabilities that went far beyond anything the civilian world typically encountered. The next 12 hours would determine whether this situation ended with negotiation or demonstration. Rodriguez's intelligence report arrived with my morning coffee. It painted a picture of desperate men making increasingly dangerous decisions. Derek Kowalski had been discharged from military police for excessive force, suffering from untreated PTSD that showed up as aggressive behavior toward anyone he saw as challenging authority. Tommy was his younger brother, less intelligent, but more desperate due to mounting financial problems from gambling debts and child support obligations. Rick's operation was funded entirely by stolen HOA money, which meant he was too deep into criminal liability to back down without facing federal prison time. The recordings Brady smuggled from Emma revealed the sophistication of her preparation. My daughter had turned on voice memo apps, hidden backup devices, and created multiple evidence streams using emergency protocols we'd practiced annually since her mother's death. She's been recording everything, Brady reported. Your daughter's smarter than any of us gave her credit for. The audio files captured Derek and Tommy discussing keeping this quiet. Rick's promises of easy retirement money and detailed conversations about escalating intimidation tactics if I didn't comply with their demands. Rick's countermove came in the form of an emergency HOA meeting designed to paint me as an unstable veteran threat. He'd spent the morning calling long-time residents, exploiting community fears about military violence, while positioning himself as the victim of excessive retaliation. The psychological manipulation was textbook narcissist behavior, flipping the story to make the aggressor appear defensive while casting the actual victim as the danger to community safety. Mrs. Patterson's courage grew stronger as the day progressed. She arrived at my door with tears in her eyes and a story that revealed the true scope of Rick's systematic abuse of power. Mac, Rick destroyed my late husband's memorial garden last year, she said, her voice breaking with held grief. He claimed it violated aesthetic standards, but Harold had been tending that garden for 30 years. I've been too scared to fight back, watching him hurt other families. But seeing him terrorize Emma, I can't stay quiet anymore. The community divide became apparent as neighbors began choosing sides. 60% supported me based on personal relationships, built over 3 years of helping with home repairs, snow removal, and emergency assistance. 40% remained loyal too. Rick, out of fear that challenging his authority might result in property value decreases or targeted harassment. The psychological dynamics were classic small community politics, where personal relationships matter more than abstract principles. Mr. Hendricks approached me that afternoon with the slow, deliberate walk of an 80-year-old Navy veteran who'd seen enough battles to recognize another one brewing. "Son," he said, "some of us remember when communities took care of each other instead of letting tyrants take over." Rick tried the same intimidation campaign with my late wife, threatening to fine us into bankruptcy unless we moved to an assisted living facility his friend owned. We were too old and scared to fight back. But you're not. What do you need from the old guard? Derek's psychological breakdown accelerated as Rodriguez's surveillance team applied pressure through legal channels. The recordings captured Derek telling Tommy that the situation was way bigger than bar fights and security jobs, that I had resources they didn't understand or anticipate. Tommy's response revealed their fundamental miscalculation. Rick said it would be easy money. Just scare some soft civilians who'd fold under official pressure. Rick's demand for a public confrontation revealed his fatal character flaw. Narcissists need validation and control, especially when their authority is challenged. He wanted me to appear at the HOA meeting to publicly apologize and submit to community rehabilitation programs, not realizing he was choosing a battlefield where I held every tactical advantage. Public forums favor preparation, documentation, and psychological composure, all areas where military training provides decisive benefits. My response was carefully calculated to exploit Rick's overconfidence. "Rick, you want public? You'll get public. See you tomorrow night." I could hear the satisfaction in his voice as he interpreted my agreement as submission rather than strategic positioning. He had no idea that, by demanding public confrontation, he just walked into exactly the kind of engagement where 22 years of military experience would prove overwhelming against small-town political manipulation. That evening, I reviewed the complete intelligence picture Rodriguez had assembled. Rick's financial desperation, his wife Karen's law firm under investigation for client fund irregularities, Derek and Tommy's criminal backgrounds, and the sophisticated legal loopholes they'd exploited to create temporary legitimacy. The operation was more complex than simple harassment. It was a criminal enterprise using HOA authority as legal camouflage for extortion and kidnapping. The final piece of the puzzle came from Brady's revelation about Rick's long-term psychological abuse. Years of controlling every aspect of his son's life, monitoring friendships, dictating activities, and using emotional manipulation to maintain dominance. Emma's rejection hadn't just wounded Rick's pride. It had challenged his fundamental belief that he could control everyone around him through fear and intimidation. This wasn't about community standards or HOA authority. It was about a broken man desperately trying to prove he still had power over other people's lives. The community center held 217 people that Thursday night, more than had attended any HOA meeting in the organization's history. Local news crews positioned cameras, while residents filled every available seat and lined the walls with the nervous energy of spectators expecting conflict. Rick stood at the podium with his microphone and legal documentation, confident in his prepared presentation about community safety concerns and my inappropriate military response to civilian authority. Rodriguez had coordinated positioning with military precision. Plainclothes colleagues occupied strategic locations while Agent Kim from the FBI sat inconspicuously among concerned citizens. Officer Powell waited outside with backup units, officially present for crowd control, that prepared for the arrests that Rodriguez's investigation had made inevitable. The room felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided, but only half the participants knew which way it was going. Rick's opening move was pure psychological warfare, a professional presentation designed to trigger emotional responses while appearing reasonable to neutral observers. He attempted to provoke me with personal attacks about my deceased wife, single parenting challenges, and alleged inability to adjust to civilian life after military service. His strategy was transparent to anyone with interrogation training, but effective enough to make several longtime residents nod in agreement with his concerns about veteran stability. Mrs. Henderson from Maple Street whispered loudly to her neighbor, "I always thought there was something off about military people." Mr. Chun shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly torn between his respect for me and Rick's official sounding concerns. The psychological manipulation was working on exactly the demographic Rick had targeted: older residents who valued stability and feared change or conflict in their peaceful community. The room's energy shifted dramatically when Emma walked through the entrance at 8:30, flanked by Brady and Agent Kim. Complete silence fell as 200 people realized that the allegedly detained teenager was not only free but prepared to speak. Rick's confident expression cracked for the first time, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and barely controlled panic as he realized his entire narrative was about to collapse. "Before anyone votes on anything," Emma announced, "I think you should hear what happened. All of it." Her voice carried none of the fear or uncertainty that Rick had described in his presentation. Instead, she spoke with the clear articulation of someone who'd inherited both her mother's intelligence and her father's tactical thinking. She produced a folder containing printed transcripts and digital files that would systematically demolish every lie Rick had constructed. The evidence presentation unfolded like a prosecutor's closing argument. Emma played the first recording, Rick's voice audible, discussing how to teach the Reynolds family a permanent lesson that would serve as an example to other non-compliant residents. Gasps echoed through the room as neighbors recognized the cold calculation in his tone. Mrs. Patterson covered her mouth in shock, finally understanding the true scope of Rick's manipulative campaign. The second recording revealed Derek and Tommy discussing their fake badges and weapons procurement, laughing about easy money for scaring civilians who would fold under official pressure. Several residents turned to stare at Rick with growing disgust as they realized the extent of the deception. Mr. Hendricks stood up slowly, his Navy veteran dignity radiating outrage, as he pointed an accusatory finger at Rick's increasingly pale face. Brady's testimony provided the psychological context that the community desperately needed to understand. "My father hasn't been protecting this community," he said. his voice shaking with years of suppressed emotion and finally released truth. He's been terrorizing it one family at a time, using HOA rules as weapons against anyone who won't submit to his absolute control. He told me that breaking people was necessary for maintaining order. That fear was the only thing civilians truly respected. Rick's psychological breakdown accelerated with each revelation, his carefully maintained facade crumbling in real time before the entire community. His denial phase involved increasingly frantic accusations of coordinated attacks by unstable veterans who couldn't handle civilian authority. His anger phase erupted in personal attacks that revealed his true character, screaming about ungrateful residents who didn't appreciate his years of dedicated service to community improvement and property value maintenance. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward with her accounting records, her 73-year-old voice stronger than anyone had heard in years. Rick embezzled $47,000 from our community funds to pay for this criminal operation, she announced, holding up bank statements and forged invoices. He destroyed my husband's memorial garden and threatened to fine us into bankruptcy when we questioned his increasingly expensive security initiatives that benefited no one except his personal bank account. The bargaining phase of Rick's collapse featured desperate attempts to shift blame entirely onto Derek and Tommy, claiming he'd been manipulated by criminal elements who'd exploited his good intentions. But the recordings Emma played next revealed Rick's detailed planning and coordination, his voice giving specific instructions about intimidation tactics and legal loopholes that would protect them from law enforcement intervention. My response was deliberately calm and factual, drawing on decades of military briefings where emotional control determined mission success. Rick, you're right about one thing, I said. I am trained for violence, but 22 years teaching soldiers taught me something more important: how to protect innocent people from bullies without becoming one myself. I presented a timeline of Rick's escalating harassment, legal violations, and community manipulation that demonstrated systematic abuse of authority over multiple years. Unanimous vote removing Rick from all HOA positions was followed immediately by criminal charges filed by multiple residents for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Agent Kim arrested Derek and Tommy for interstate kidnapping, while Officer Powell served warrants for outstanding charges in Virginia. The transformation from Rick's confident presentation to his handcuffed removal took less than 90 minutes, proving that truth and preparation ultimately triumphed over lies and intimidation. Emma's final statement captured the evening's significance perfectly. Dad taught me that bullies count on good people staying quiet, she announced to sustained applause that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Tonight, we proved they're wrong. When communities decide to stand together instead of standing aside, a spontaneous celebration followed that felt like liberation from years of accumulated fear and intimidation. Proof that one person's courage can inspire an entire community to reclaim its dignity and self-respect. 3 months later, Derek received 8 years in federal prison for multiple charges, including weapons violations and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. His breakdown in court was complete, sobbing apologies while claiming he'd been manipulated by Rick's promises of easy money and legal protection. The judge showed no mercy, stating that military training should have taught him to recognize illegal orders and refuse participation in criminal enterprises targeting innocent families. Tommy received 5 years in state prison, plus restitution payments, his gambling addiction and financial desperation having made him vulnerable to Rick's recruitment for criminal activities. During sentencing, he turned to face me directly, his voice breaking as he apologized for terrorizing Emma, and admitted he'd known the operation was wrong from the beginning, but needed money too desperately to walk away from Rick's promises. Rick's sentencing hearing resembled a corporate fraud trial more than a community dispute resolution. 15 years in federal prison for racketeering, kidnapping, and embezzlement, with additional charges pending as investigators discovered similar schemes he'd attempted in neighboring HOAs. Karen's divorce was finalized the same day, taking half their remaining assets, while Brady received legal emancipation and moved in with his grandparents to begin psychological recovery from years of emotional abuse. The community transformation exceeded everyone's expectations. Our new HOA structure featured rotating presidency, mandatory financial audits, and a community oversight board that prevented any individual from accumulating unchecked authority. $73,000 was recovered, plus damages funding playground equipment and community programs that Rick had systematically eliminated to increase his personal control over neighborhood activities and social interactions. Emma's college essay about her experience led to early admission at Stanford with a full scholarship for civic engagement leadership. Her writing captured lessons about courage, community responsibility, and the importance of speaking truth to power that resonated with admissions officers and professors nationwide. She planned to study pre-law with a focus on community advocacy, transforming her traumatic experience into preparation for a career protecting other families from similar abuse. Brady's redemption arc was slower but equally inspiring. Living with his grandparents while attending therapy for years of psychological abuse, he maintained a friendship with our family while working to understand how authoritarian control had shaped his childhood development. The therapy sessions revealed the full extent of Rick's manipulation, how he'd isolated Brady from friends, monitored his communications, and used emotional blackmail to maintain absolute control over every aspect of his son's developing identity and self-worth. Mr. Hendricks shared stories that revealed the full scope of Rick's systematic intimidation campaign. Rick had targeted elderly residents specifically, threatening to fine them into bankruptcy unless they moved to assisted living facilities owned by his business associates. Several families had quietly relocated rather than fight battles they felt too old and vulnerable to win, leaving the community smaller and more compliant with Rick's increasingly authoritarian demands for absolute submission to his interpretation of community standards. The national attention was unexpected but gratifying. Military Times featured my story as an example of veterans using civilian skills for community protection, inspiring other veteran families to establish mutual support networks in their neighborhoods. Federal legislation cited Emma's case in new bills limiting HOA enforcement authority and requiring transparency in community governance that would protect future families from similar abuse. My FBI consulting career developed gradually, focusing on community-based threat assessment and veteran integration programs, training federal agents about the psychological dynamics of small community conflicts proved surprisingly relevant to national security concerns about domestic extremism and local government corruption. The skills that military service had taught me found a new purpose in protecting civilian communities from various forms of systematic abuse. Rick's attempted retaliation from prison was pathetically predictable. Recorded phone calls revealed his efforts to coordinate with cellmates for sending messages to my family, resulting in additional conspiracy charges and solitary confinement. Some people never learn that consequences follow actions, regardless of their self-perceived importance or entitlement to control other people's lives through fear and intimidation. Years later, Emma's high school graduation became a community celebration, recognizing not just her academic achievements, but her courage in standing up to systematic abuse. Her valedictorian speech referenced the importance of speaking truth to power and protecting vulnerable community members from those who would exploit authority for personal gain. The Netflix series announcement came with my agreement to donate consulting fees to veterans' community integration programs. The long-term impact exceeded any expectations I'd had when Rick first declared war on my family. 89 HOAs nationwide adopted transparency protocols based on our community model. Federal guidelines referenced our case in official policy recommendations. Veteran organizations used our story to demonstrate positive civilian leadership roles for military families. Transitioning to community life. 5 years later, Emma graduated from law school and became a federal prosecutor specializing in community fraud cases. Using her personal experience to understand the psychology of local corruption and abuse of authority, her conviction rate of 31 successful prosecutions out of 33 cases reflected both her legal skills and her deep understanding of how systematic intimidation operates in small community environments. Brady completed his engineering degree and married Emma's college roommate, building a life based on principles of service and community support, rather than control and manipulation. His involvement in veteran support programs that I'd established demonstrated how children can break cycles of psychological abuse when provided with positive role models and therapeutic support for recovering from authoritarian family environments. Mrs. Patterson remained our HOA treasurer at age 78. Her meticulous financial documentation, having become legendary among community organizations seeking transparency models. The memorial garden built on the site of Rick's former violation enforcement office honored her late husband and all residents who'd suffered under his systematic intimidation campaign. Her courage in speaking truth to power had inspired other elderly residents to become community advocates rather than silent victims. The garden itself became a powerful symbol of transformation and healing. Where Rick had once operated his enforcement office demanding compliance and issuing citations, now grew roses, herbs, and vegetables that community members tended collectively. Children played among the flower beds while their grandparents shared stories of how the neighborhood had changed, teaching younger generations about the importance of standing up to bullies and protecting vulnerable community members from those who would abuse positions of authority. Mr. Hendricks passed away peacefully, but not before telling me that our confrontation with Rick had reminded him why good people must never surrender to bullies, regardless of their official positions or community authority. That lesson was worth more than any military decoration, he said, because it proved that civilian courage could be as powerful as military training when applied to protecting innocent people from systematic abuse. The national impact of Emma's law exceeded our wildest expectations. Federal legislation limiting HOA enforcement authority, requiring financial transparency, and establishing resident rights protections became model policy for state and local governments nationwide. The documentary, The HOA War, won an Emmy for demonstrating how individual courage can inspire systemic change when communities decide to support justice over convenience. My marriage to Sarah 3 years after Emma's rescue represented personal healing that I hadn't thought possible after losing my first wife. Sarah's patient support helped me process grief, while building new foundations for family happiness that included, but extended beyond my military identity. Our wedding became a community celebration with Emma, Brady, and Mrs. Patterson in the wedding party, symbolizing how crisis can create chosen family bonds stronger than biological relationships. Emma's prosecutorial success was measured not just in conviction rates, but in the ripple effects of her work protecting other families from community-based abuse. Her courtroom dedication speech honored my father, who taught me that justice isn't about winning, it's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. That philosophy guided her career choices and personal relationships, transforming trauma into purpose-driven service. Emma's mentorship program connected young people who'd experienced community abuse with legal professionals who could guide their healing and career development. 12 teenagers received full scholarships through the program, each one committed to using their education for community service and protecting vulnerable populations from systematic intimidation and abuse. Rick's current status represented perfect poetic justice, still in federal prison with no family contact, working a library job while serving his 15-year sentence alone with the consequences of his choices. His attempts at prison interviews claiming rehabilitation and requesting second chances were ignored by family members who'd learned that some bridges should stay permanently burned to prevent future abuse. The prison psychologist's reports obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests revealed Rick's continued inability to accept responsibility for his actions. He blamed his victims, the legal system, and society's failure to appreciate his contributions to community improvement, demonstrating the narcissistic personality traits that had made his rehabilitation impossible and his isolation from family necessary for their continued healing and safety. 10 years after Rick's arrest, Emma's wedding became the ultimate symbol of community transformation and personal triumph. Walking my daughter down the aisle in the same community center where Rick had been exposed felt like completing a circle that began with violence and ended with love. My speech referenced how facing down one bully had taught an entire community the value of standing together against any form of systematic intimidation. The epilogue of our story continues evolving as Emma builds her prosecutorial career. Brady raises his family according to principles of service rather than control, and our community serves as a model for effective governance based on transparency and mutual support. Property values increased by 40%, while establishing waiting lists for new residents, who specifically sought neighborhoods with veteran leadership and proven track records of protecting families from abuse. Rick's legacy is a cautionary tale about what happens when unchecked authority meets systematic resistance from people who refuse to be intimidated. His downfall proved that bullies ultimately depend on good people remaining silent, and communities have more power than they realize when they decide to support justice over convenience, truth over comfort, and courage over compliance with illegitimate authority. Today, Emma works as a federal prosecutor. Brady is a successful engineer and father. Mrs. Patterson still tends her memorial garden at 83 years old. And our community stands as proof that ordinary people can defeat extraordinary bullies when they decide to stand together. The most important lesson? Sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought on foreign battlefields. They're fought in our backyards when regular families decide they've had enough of being pushed around. Justice doesn't always come from courts or cops. Sometimes it comes from fathers who won't let anyone terrorize their families, and from communities that remember what real leadership looks like. Rick thought he could break my family. Instead, he taught an entire neighborhood that bullies only win when good people do nothing. That's a lesson worth remembering.